Frederick Douglass put it plainly, if there is no struggle, there's no progress. And as the nation split apart in 1861, that struggle became a full-scale war between two very different regions with two very different visions of America.
What begins as a fight to preserve the Union quickly becomes something larger, about slavery, freedom, and the future of the Republic. But at the outset, neither side has any idea how long, bloody, or transformative this conflict is going to end up being.
So today, we are taking you through the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. We're going to look at how the Union and the Confederacy entered the conflict, what advantages and weaknesses each carried, and how these early choices shape everything that followed. All right, welcome back, guys.
Hi.
Feels
Good to
like
be
we
back.
feels like we never left.
Feels like we never left.
Yeah.
We've got a lot to cover here. This is the Civil War. I had a professor who always used to say, fratricidal Civil War.
Fratricidal, nice.
Brothers killing brothers.
Isn't
it kind of repetitive?
it's redundant?
Yeah, but
Every Civil War is
you'd
fratricidal.
always say a fratricidal Civil War. So let's stack up the two sides. On paper, the Union has huge advantages. So first off, population. There are roughly, at this time, 22 million people living in the Union and about 9 million in the Confederacy. And out of that 9 million, about 3.5 to 4 million people are enslaved. And these are people that the Confederacy is trying to keep in chains, obviously, right? So then moving on to industry, about 80 to 90% of the nation's manufacturing capacity comes from the North. And that's huge when you think about making war, and especially this modern war. That manufacturing is going to be everything to supply these armies, or one army, I should say. Transportation, 2/3 of railroad mileage and most of the merchant shipping also come from the North. And then finance, there's many more banks, more capital, and easier access to credit also in the North.
Right. So if you just look at those statistics, it seems like the North, the Union, should have very little trouble squashing this rebellion. But the Confederacy is far from doomed from the start because it has some advantages that are less easy to see at first. But when you consider that it's fighting mostly a defensive war on its own home territory with a population that is largely supportive, that's a big one there. They're not going to really have to go on the offensive very often, even though they try. Really, what the South has to do is not necessarily win the war. It just has to outlast Northern public opinion. Hopefully, from the Southern perspective, the North will tire of the war and will negotiate for peace. And then early on, it does have a very strong officer corps and a population that's a little bit more militaristic. It has deep roots in the Mexican-American War. So at least at first, the population seems more united around the home front versus the North. And Southerners also have in their back pocket King Cotton. And the idea is that cotton will eventually force Britain and France to the table, and in order to maintain their supply of Southern cotton, they will recognize the South as an independent nation, and that may turn the tide of the war.
And I just want to emphasize one thing. The Confederacy is not doomed from the start.
Yeah, I did.
So, no, I know, but we'll remember that because that does become part of what we'll discuss as the lost cause myth eventually.
Oh, yes, I get where you're going with that. Yeah.
We'll get to that. But just so you know, just so everybody knows.
Everybody knows now.
Everybody knows.
Does everybody know now?
Said it.
All right.
Listeners, do you know?
Yes.
Okay. They said yes. So the way each side will mobilize will reflect their respective political cultures. In the North, you've got the federal government using the crisis to build a more centralized modern state. It passes the first national income tax. Thanks. Issues greenbacks or paper money. It creates a new national banking system, all laying the groundwork for a stronger federal role in the economy that we're going to see later.
Through every war, too, I think continuity.
Absolutely.
Every single war that the United States gets into, this lays the groundwork for a stronger federal role.
Absolutely. It'll also institute a draft conscription in 1863 that allows substitution or paying a fee. So, people with means, with money, can hire somebody to serve in their place. That in and of itself will provoke a lot of resistance, especially among working class immigrants, like the New York City draft riots that we'll see.
And then in the Confederacy, the new Confederate government has to build everything from scratch while fighting a war. And it's constantly bumping up against the states' rights ideology that it has committed to. Confederate leaders are going to pass their own conscription law in 1862, even earlier than the Union. And later policies like the, quote, 20 Negro law exempt large slaveholders, overseers, fueling class tensions. And there's also going to be hyperinflation and shortages of all kinds of products imaginable. And this is going to hammer ordinary white Southerners.
So what do you know?
Yeah, I was going to
What do
say
you
there's
know?
a
You
theme here.
actually need a government.
Yeah, one, the federal, any type of government to fight a war needs a whole bunch of power, and two, it's always going to be the poor people who fight.
Oh my God, yeah. So if you got money, you're going to be able to get out of something.
Oh yeah, you're fine.
Yeah.
So both sides expand the central government, but the Union does it way more successfully. They already have the institutions that are important to waging a war, and these institutions are going to be lasting. And again, the Confederacy is all about states' rights, but ultimately it tries to create its own strong central government in order to win a war.
So technologically, the Civil War is surprisingly modern. You've got things like new rifled muskets and the Manet ball, which make infantry fire much more accurate and deadly at longer range. That's a big deal. You've got the telegraph and expanded railroad networks, letting commanders and politicians move information and supplies faster. In many instances, Lincoln's setting up telegraph centers around where he can get information in and out to the powers that be, his military. And in naval warfare, you have the ironclads like the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, plus a massive Union blockade.
But strategy and tactics, they don't immediately keep up with the technology. Generals are still going to order big frontal assaults and tight transformations or tight formations. This is very Napoleonic in military style. And fields are going to be swept by rifled fire. And the result is just absolute carnage on a scale that Americans have never seen before.
Really, that the world had never seen before. The irony is that many of the generals in this war were trained in the exact same fashion. Mm-hmm. So they literally went to military school together, and then they fought together in the Mexican-American War. So they were using the exact same strategies that were devised for an earlier age,
right,
with modern weaponry that just was a complete mismatch. And if you really want to understand it, the reason that World War I always say, is fought in trenches was because military strategists had studied the American Civil War and learned that this old Napoleonic style is not going to work.
Right.
So early in the war, though, General Winfield Scott of the Union, controlling the commanding the Union forces, proposes what's known as the famous Anaconda Plan, which is basically squeeze the South by slowly blockading its coast, so stopping the shipment of cotton, seizing the Mississippi River, cutting it in half, and slowly strangling the Southern economy so they're not able to wage war. So it's not the only strategy that the Union ends up using, but the blockade and the push down the Mississippi become crucial turning points of the war. Union naval power, backed up by its industrial base, is going to turn out to be probably pretty much the biggest advantage that they have overall.
Yeah, and the first big land battle, the Battle of Bull Run, or the First Manassas in Virginia, July 1861, is a shock. Northerners show up with picnic baskets, expecting a quick Union victory. They're really worried about missing it.
Right.
There's like this whole thing is going to fly by,
It's the event,
and we want to see some action. So instead, Confederate forces under generals like Thomas Stonewall Jackson send them reeling back to Washington, and it shatters the illusion of a short, glorious war.
And then in the West, the Union is much more successful early on. Ulysses S. Grant, we know his name. He's going to capture Forts Henry and Donelson in Tennessee, which is going to open up key rivers. And then the fighting at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862 is going to be brutal. Tens of thousands of casualties in just 2 days. So people have never seen anything on this scale. And meanwhile, the Union Navy is going to help capture New Orleans, which is going to cripple Southern trade on the Mississippi.
In Virginia, though, it's rougher going for the Union. General McClellan, the Union general, tries to invade the South in his famous Peninsula campaign, but it's going to stall just outside of Richmond. And then enter Robert E. Lee, who famously takes command of the Army of Northern Virginia and wins a series of largely defensive victories at 7 Days, Second Bull Run, that will build Confederate confidence and set the stage for invasions into the North.
So here's a key shift. Enslaved people are not just passive bystanders in this story. From the very beginning of the war, enslaved men and women start fleeing to Union lines, especially where the Union Army appears.
And there's a pretty good example of this. In April of 1861, General Benjamin Butler at Fortress Monroe.
Benjamin Butler.
Yeah.
This is good alliteration.
Yeah.
I admire that.
At Fortress Monroe in Virginia, he is going to refuse to return 3 enslaved men who escaped to his fort. And he calls them, quote, contraband of war. This basically means enemy property being used for military purposes. And that contraband policy is going to spread, and enslaved people begin voting with their feet.
It's really the actions of enslaved people that forces Congress's hand, and they're going to follow with the First Confiscation Act in 1861, authorizing the seizure of enslaved people being used to support the Confederate war effort. The Second Confiscation Act in 1862 goes even further, declaring enslaved people of rebel masters in Union-occupied areas, quote-unquote, forever free. Now, there's a lot of distinctions there and a lot of requirements, but it is a really important step, and you could really make a strong causation argument that was enslaved people's actions on the ground that forces federal policy.
Absolutely. And so all of this is the tension is mounting, and it's going to set the stage for Antietam. And in September of 1862, Lee invades Maryland. On September 17th, near Sharpsburg, the two armies fight the single bloodiest day in American history, about 23,000 casualties. It's tactically inconclusive, but Lee withdraws back to Virginia. So Lincoln is going to be able to use this to claim a strategic Union victory.
And the Civil War, and any war really, can, I think, seem very overwhelming because there are so many battles and it's so difficult to keep them to keep track of them. And I think what's great about the Civil War is that you don't need to know every single battle, but you do need to understand that battles lead to political decisions. And Antietam is a great example of that Lincoln had been waiting for a battlefield success to issue a major policy shift in what the war was all about. And that becomes what we know as the Emancipation Proclamation. And he knows if he acts from a position of weakness, if there's not a strategic victory, it might look desperate. But after Antietam, he feels like he has enough steam behind the Union and their military cause to address this preliminary proclamation. And then in September, the final version, he releases it in September, but the final version will take effect on January 1st of 1863.
The proclamation didn't free enslaved people everywhere. That's often students are confused by that, or I think generally people are confused by that. What it did, though, it applied to areas in rebellion against the United States. Why? Well, Lincoln was careful not to anger loyal border states, and he didn't really want to anger Union-occupied parts of the Confederacy. So is this largely symbolic in the moment? Yes, but it's an important and critical step in changing what the war was about. It turns the war into this demand and cry for preserving the Union and also to create lasting freedom, which does a couple important things. It helps keep Britain and France out. I don't think a lot of general history fans necessarily know this, that England and France were really pondering possibly doing something to open up southern ports so that cotton could start to leak out. And there were negotiations happening. And as one of the reasons that Lee invaded was to try to make it seem like the South had a fighting chance and that the South was not only defending but attacking, to try to show, especially Britain, that maybe they were the right horse to bet on. So with this Emancipation Proclamation, suddenly Lincoln does something brilliant. He says, are you really going to join a war to support slavery? Because now this is a war to defeat slavery. Which side are you going to be on? And it signals to enslaved people that the Union is committed to their liberation. And so this only leads to more and more slaves escaping. And probably one of the most important things it does in terms of military strategy is it opens the door for black enlistment in the Union Army and Navy.
Yeah, and by the end of the war, around 180,000 black men are going to serve in the Army, and another 20,000 are going to serve in the Navy, which is about roughly 10% of Union forces throughout the war. And many are formerly enslaved. Others are free black men throughout the North. And I know in our classes we've been watching Glory, which is a great film about the 54th Massachusetts. And Lincoln's, we talked about his journey in class. We usually talk about it as his odyssey, how he goes through this journey to change over time about some of the opinions that he once held. And he writes that actually witnessing black military service and their valor and bravery and hard work really changes how he perceives the entire war and also the racial hierarchy. And their service, it's a very powerful argument for black citizenship and political rights in the years to come.
And make no mistake, that racial hierarchy that you referred to is still in place in the North and certainly within the Army. So these black enlisted men are going to face horrible discrimination, segregated units. White officers will be in charge of them. And for much of the war, they will be paid at a lower rate than white soldiers. So Confederate policy threatens to execute or re-enslave captured black soldiers. So you've got that pressure as well. But they fight with enormous courage at places like Fort Wagner in South Carolina, which is highlighted in the movie Glory, and in dozens of lesser-known battles and garrison posts. So now it's 1863, and we are coming up on what many historians see as the turning point of the war, Gettysburg and Vicksburg.
Yeah, they're going to happen at the same time, two different places. In the East, Robert E. Lee is going to invade the North again, this time into Pennsylvania. This is going to be the high watermark of the Confederacy. And from July 1st through the 3rd of 1863, Union and Confederate forces are going to clash at Gettysburg. And this will end with the famous Pickett's Charge by the Confederate forces, which was a doomed frontal assault across an open ground under murderous fire, which is a tragic example of old tactics meeting new weapons. And if you've ever stood where Pickett's Charge happened,
I have.
I have as well. Have you, Mr.
I have
Hill?
not.
Oh my gosh! I just I stood out there and I imagined being a 16-year-old in the Confederate Army and just looking straight up and thinking, "Holy something!"
Holy cow! I was, as a kid, obsessed with the Battle of Gettysburg. I can, if you wanted me to, I can draw the whole thing out in all the battle maps,
Little
the
round
fish
top.
hook.
That is incredibly impressive because it is a massive battlefield. If you've never been to Gettysburg, this is not something that you can just walk around. I mean, you can walk around, but you cannot see this whole thing by walking around. You have to drive around this battlefield. And a lot of Civil War battlefields are like that.
Yeah, it was massive. I made my family in 8th grade. I got to pick our family vacation, and we went to, my pick was Gettysburg.
Heck yeah.
And I like to think my parents were just like, oh my God, what?
We are cut from the same cloth.
I was going to say, Ms.
Yeah.
Kellner, you have similar stories. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I won't nerd out too much, but I will say that Gettysburg is an incredibly important battle because it halts Lee's northern advance, and the Confederacy will never again be able to seriously threaten northern soil at that scale. And at pretty much the exact same time in the West, basically the next day, Grant is going to capture Vicksburg, an incredibly important city on the Mississippi, after a long siege. So now the Union has full control of the Mississippi. The Confederacy is split in two.
And the Union needed these because they had
it wasn't
been
going
all
so
these
well.
all these commanders, these generals of the Army of the Potomac in the East. It was just blunder after blunder after blunder. So these two victories are huge.
Oh, and we should say after this, we'll talk about the Gettysburg Address in a second, I believe. But I just remembered that it was in 1863 that Lincoln issued the call for a day of Thanksgiving.
Yes.
Ah.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Here we are. Happy Thanksgiving. He thought the nation really needed something to be thankful for, grateful for after the tremendous losses occurring in the
He
in the
might
war.
have moved up on my list of favorite presidents.
Yeah, how
maybe
about that?
maybe to number one.
Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. That the Thanksgiving thing kind of put him over the top. So in November, Lincoln travels to Gettysburg to dedicate the National Cemetery there, and he gives what would become the Gettysburg Address. Just a couple of minutes long. The guy in front of him spoke for 2 hours.
Yep.
And the president was invited kind of as an afterthought. It's under 300 words, but it's one of those primary sources that APUSH loves because it reframes the meaning of the war. Remember, at the beginning, it was like, it's not about slavery, it's about keeping the Union together. Lincoln says this, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Notice that quote, new birth of freedom. He's looking back to the Declaration of Independence, and he's looking forward to a future where the Union is not just remade or brought back together, but it's restored, but it's different this time. It's now truly upholding those words in the Declaration of Independence that we once had a birth of freedom from Britain. Now we will have another new birth of freedom for 4 million enslaved people in our nation. And he doesn't just spell out this racial equality, but the language really opens up that door eventually.
I like how you kind of let that dramatic pause intentionally. I know you did.
I
I didn't.
I think people were in deep thought, and I
Well,
think you allowed for that.
Yeah, you gave them space to
Right.
think and to feel.
I'm holding space. I was going to edit it out, but now I think I'll just leave
Yeah,
it.
you gotta leave it
Leave
in.
it.
I'll just
Leave
leave it.
it.
I
It's
couldn't.
important.
The truth is, I didn't realize we were breaking, and I couldn't decide which button to press.
But here we are. Let's finish this war here. All right.
Yeah,
It-
let's just finish up
let's
the
just
war.
run through it.
Easy peasy.
Okay, it's 1864, and Lincoln, as we said, has shifted to put a new guy in charge here. Ulysses S. Grant from the West takes control of all Union armies. It's not a strategy that's flashy or anything like that. It's just about kind of relentlessly grinding the South down. He knows that the North, kind of messed up, but he knows the North can replace its losses more easily than the South because the North has such a larger population. So he says, let's just fight this thing out. We're gonna continuously kind of chase Lee down, and they can only last for so long.
And so let's make sure that we remember not to take this new strategy for granted.
Very good.
Oh wow,
Nice.
that was good.
Yeah. So it's brutal. This new brand of warfare, grinded out, scorched earth warfare. Casualties are staggering, and Northern public opinion starts to waver a little bit, but Grant keeps the pressure on.
And in the West, Grant has been replaced, and William Tecumseh Sherman is going to march from Chattanooga to capture Atlanta in September of 1864. A huge boost for Lincoln's reelection campaign. Again, I think of the Civil War about how military engagements are informing political decisions and political happenings. And then from there, Sherman is going to launch his very famous March to the Sea from Atlanta to Savannah. And his troops, 60 miles wide? The troops,
The swath.
yeah, swinging down from Atlanta to Savannah, 60 miles wide of Union troops. They destroy everything. Railroads, they're going to seize food. They're going to target infrastructure that supports the Confederate war effort. And they're not, also they're doing, some of them are doing really horrible things to people who live in these areas and unspeakable things, really. So I do think we have to acknowledge that.
Right. And on the other hand, historians say, look, was this total war? Maybe, maybe not. There were some terrible things done. But at the same time, the quicker the war ended, the less suffering overall. So that was sort of the argument for Sherman to march so definitively.
Wow, another continuity we'll see with the end of World War II.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
But Sherman basically says, look, it's the white Southern civilians in the Deep South who started the war, so it's time they pay for it. It accelerates the collapse of slavery. Tens of thousands of enslaved people are going to be able to flee now to Union lines along the way.
And you guys, I know you guys show that film in class, the Civil War in 4 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
You guys show that thing?
I have, yeah.
So it's kind of like the Confederacy at this point. It looks like, and I always say to my students, I'm like, it looks like a piece of soap in the shower. Every time you get in there, it's a little smaller. It's just
Yeah.
like
That's
it's
good,
like
yeah.
scrunching up. So it is crumbling, the Confederacy, by 1865. Richmond has fallen. Lee's army is starving and outnumbered, and desertions are starting to mount up. So on April 9th, 1865, Lee formally surrenders to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia.
And Appomattox Courthouse is a little town. It's not an actual courthouse, just so everybody knows. And Grant is going to offer pretty generous terms, actually. Confederate soldiers can go home with their horses or mules to plant crops. Officers can also keep their sidearms, so not their main rifles, but sidearms are fine. The goal is to end the fighting, not to humiliate the enemy. And that's very Lincoln-esque.
Yes,
Very
yes.
magnanimous is the word we will use to describe.
It's an eye toward the future.
Yeah, and it's a moment full of possibility for Reconstruction. And again, in every war, people are thinking not necessarily, they're thinking about what's happening in the present, but also future plans. Like, how are we going to put all of this back together? And that is something that Lincoln had been thinking about throughout the entirety of the war. But it leaves a lot of unanswered questions about freedom, equality, and how to rebuild a shattered nation.
Yeah, so we've got some real quick. Let's kind of think about memory, monuments, states' rights, and how we talk about the Civil War today, because people still do argue about what caused the Civil War, how we should remember it. There are debates about Confederate monuments, flags, school curriculum, and how should this thing be taught. It's very much alive today.
Absolutely. And one of the biggest takeaways from this episode, I think, and from the primary sources, is that we shouldn't let vague phrases like states' rights replace specifics. When Southern leaders explained themselves in 1860 and 61, they talked specifically about slavery, its expansion, its protection, its centrality to their society.
And that doesn't mean that there weren't smaller causes or issues that led to the Civil War. But when you read those secession declarations from December of 1860 and into the early months of 1861, the cornerstone speech, pro-secession sermons and editorials, slavery is not in the footnotes. You do not have to read between the lines to see it. It is the headline. And I think understanding that really helps us cut through modern myths and see how deeply race and labor are woven into American history.
And it further underscores that this war did become a war about freedom.
Yeah, it didn't start like that. The original purpose in Lincoln's first inaugural, we got to restore the Union. But by 1863, it is about it's about getting rid of the institution of slavery.
And that's where we'll leave things. Slavery is now and forever defeated. The question we have in front of us is, how do we put this thing back together? So thanks for tuning in to A Push for All. If you liked the episode, go ahead and subscribe on Spotify, iTunes, YouTube. Leave us a review. If you got a topic you want us to cover, send us a message on Instagram at A Push for All.
Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.